Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today, I thought I would come to you with kind of a quick video about my first read for Ancientsathon this year. If you don't know anything about Ancientsathon, it is a readathon that I am co-hosting with Tori from Hufflepuff Discovery and David Wiley. I will link to their channels down below. The overall goal of the entire readathon is just to read works that were written before 1700, and so it doesn't technically have to be ancient classics, but I found myself wanting to kind of structure my TBR around ancient classics this year. And so the first book that I read for Ancientsathon is an ancient classic, and it's a play, which was one of the prompts for Ancientsathon. And I am talking about Electra by Euripides. And I have some mixed emotions about this. This is definitely a play that was a reread for me. And so I just kind of want to talk through my emotions here. And some of them are emotions about rereading. But so I read this with Rainey from Rainy Day Reads. I'll also link to her channel down below. And it's really interesting to read a play with Rainey because she has a very strong theater background. And so we were kind of able to talk a little bit about how this must have been put on. But I've kind of learned something from this experience, and it's something that I've not always thought was true. But now, maybe I'm just at a different time in my life, and it really is. I told this to Rainey, and now I'm telling it to y'all. But there's definitely something to the old adage that it's better to watch a play than it is to read it. That plays were never intended to be read. They were intended to be watched on stage, or now we can watch them on screen. And so you lose quite a bit of the magic and the charm of the play when you're just reading the text on the page. And I don't typically find that to be true with people like Shakespeare. I think a lot of the joy for me with Shakespeare is reading the language and kind of dissecting what he's saying. And for me, a lot of that I've always felt would be lost if I was actually watching the play, because I wouldn't be able to possibly catch everything that the actors were saying. But I've actually, weirdly enough, never seen a Shakespeare play put on live. And I know that sounds so weird, and I need to correct that. I really do. But Electra by Euripides is such an interesting one. Prior to this reread, I have always felt like this was my favorite ancient Greek play. And I'm going to set the book down just because I have a lot of feelings and I don't want to hold the book the entire video. But I'm now wondering if the play that I really loved about Electra was Sophocles' play. I told this to Rainey too. It's been so long for me since I read any of these, and I was a drama student in high school. And so we definitely did kind of a Greek comedy, a Greek tragedy section where we read the plays and then we acted in them. And that's been over 10 years ago for me now. And so for me, all of the really big ancient playwrights, specifically from Greece, they've kind of blurred together in my mind a little bit. Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides, everything they did kind of blurs together for me, because often with myth-based plays, a lot of different playwrights wrote a play based on their own interpretation of the myth. And so that for me has an added layer of confusion, and it's just been so long that I can no longer tell them apart. And I can't remember whose telling of the myth was my favorite one. And mentioning my time in drama club leads me into one of my thoughts about rereading, because maybe this was the play that I thought was my favorite Greek play, but because I acted in it, I have a very different memory of it than if I had just read it on the page. Because I looked on Goodreads, and I certainly didn't have Goodreads when I was in high school, and I was never tracking my reading. I really wish that I had. But somewhere in the past few years, I went on Goodreads and had rated this play 5 stars. But upon finishing it this time, I feel like the play is only 3 stars for me. And I don't know if just in general, your tastes change, and something that really appealed to me as a teenager doesn't appeal to me now, or if maybe part of my enjoyment of it was the fact that I was able to be in the scene. I was able to act out the play. But again, so much is blurred together for me. I don't know if it was Euripides' Electra that I loved, Sophocles' Electra that I loved, maybe even Euripides' Orestes in a weird way might have been the one that I loved. I do just really love Electra as a figure, and so there's always a level of enjoyment with her myth. And I think it's an interesting conversation to have about myths and interpretation of myths, specifically with the Greek playwrights. Because interestingly, in the introduction to my edition, I really didn't put this together. It's always very odd when you learn this, but a lot of these playwrights were living around the same time, and they were living around the same time as other really famous ancient Greek writers, philosophers. And so you have to wonder, when they wrote some of these plays, were they a little bit in competition with one another? Because apparently Sophocles' Electra and Euripides' Electra were written around the same time or near the same time. And you often see this conversation come up when people are reading more modern retellings of Greek myths, which is this the correct version of the myth? That is such a weird thing to say, because there is pretty much no correct version of the myth. There is just the way that you interpret it. And Helen, for example, by Euripides, is a very interesting example of this, where Helen apparently has a shade version of her is the one that goes to Troy, and the real Helen is actually in Egypt and is really disturbed by what this shade is doing. And yet that's not the myth as it comes down to us from Homer or from other playwrights, but that's Euripides' kind of interpretation of the myth and his telling of the myth and flipping the myth on its head. His Electra does some really interesting things as well, and I don't know if I said, but his play Electra focuses on the period when Orestes comes back from exile, and he and Electra finally plan to get their revenge, and really the culmination of the play is them getting their revenge on their mother, Clytemnestra. And so other Electra plays and other stories about Electra kind of encompass other periods of her life, but this play really hones in on what we would think of as the culmination of her story. So I think it's pretty obvious why this would be the part of the story that he was most interested in, because it's definitely the most action-packed, but he does some really interesting things here. When Orestes comes back from exile, of course, Electra doesn't recognize him, and she recognizes him in a roundabout way by analyzing his footprints and things like that. And apparently that in and of itself, his commenting on how she starts to recognize Orestes, is kind of a comment on Aeschylus's version of Electra, which is just very interesting, and something too that I think you really ought to keep in mind when we're talking about the ancient Greek playwrights, and really just in general when we're talking about ancient classics and ancient writers. There is so much we don't have. There is so much that has not survived. And you get the sense sometimes that these authors are commenting on works that clearly have not made it to the present day. So sometimes I often wonder if there are little tongue-in-cheek moments or little jokes that I don't get because I don't have access to the source material that they're poking fun at or that they're making reference to. I am really fond of Electra, and I'm really fond of Euripides' telling of Electra because I feel as though he is very sympathetic to her. Electra is a very prickly character, let's say, and I think it's very easy to put her in a couple of different categories, and Euripides actually gives her a little bit of nuance, and I actually have always liked Euripides as a playwright because I think he focuses on the women quite a bit, and a lot of the main characters of his plays are women, and so I really love, for example, Medea by him. I think Medea is one of his best, and Electra is not one of his most popular ones and is really not a play of his that people talk about very often, which does lead me to believe that maybe Sophocles' version of Electra was the one that was so electrifying to me as a teenager. But I think too, I'm just a different person. And there's something about Electra's story that I think really is compelling to the teenage mind, or to kind of, the angsty teenage experience, let's say, because Electra wants revenge. And I'm still a bit of a sucker for a revenge story, but now having read Electra by Jennifer Saint, her retelling of Electra and Clytemnestra, I am much more sympathetic to Clytemnestra's story than I am to Electra's. And so that's also something that I think changed my enjoyment of this time around is I was very sympathetic to Clytemnestra. When Clytemnestra gets her revenge on Agamemnon, that's like a moment I cheer. I'm going, yes, get him, get him. And I want it to be longer. I wish that she had taken her revenge out on him for a long time. I hate Agamemnon so much. And so now, as an older woman, I suppose I am more sympathetic to the woman's plight of Clytemnestra. And Electra is still very much locked into kind of childhood, which you understand. I'm trying to walk around the myth in case you don't know it, because I think it's a really fun and shocking story when you read it for the first time. And so I don't want to rob you of that enjoyment. But Clytemnestra taking her revenge out on her husband, Agamemnon, sets up their child, Electra, to be very resentful and angry towards her mother specifically, because she's very fond of her father. And revenge consumes Clytemnestra in many ways. And so you do sympathize with Electra because you feel as though she never got much from Clytemnestra, and neither did Orestes, her brother. And so you sympathize with them, I think, as two children who really didn't have anybody there for them, no one in their corner. But what Clytemnestra goes through, I think, is so sympathetic that really reading this was very, very hard, knowing where it was going to build to. But one of the really interesting choices I think Euripides makes is that he really, when he gives Electra some nuance, it's not just in ways of making her interesting in a good way. He makes her interesting in a bad way too, because she is definitely wallowing in her misery and just craving her revenge. And it's to the point where this is really her whole entire personality. This is all she thinks about. This is all she has. And to a certain extent, you start to wonder as a reader, as you get further into the play, you wonder how much of this she just enjoys. That she enjoys wallowing in her misery, because that's really, when you think about it, all she has. Again, going back to Euripides' emphasis on women, I think there was a very interesting conversation going on here about women and women's roles, and how Clytemnestra has committed adultery, and if she was a man, that really would not be talked about. She says that, well, if I was a man, this wouldn't really be a big deal. And Electra feeling as though Clytemnestra, as her mother, was never truly a mother to her, never truly loved her the way that a mother should, or supported her the way that a mother should. And she even says in here, women don't love their children. They love their men. And so it was just really interesting talking about women's roles, Electra as a virgin in her marriage, the symbolism there in terms of class, but also in terms of womanhood. I think in some ways locking Electra into the perspective of a child, really keeping her childlike in the play, because she was robbed of her childhood in so many ways. I find Electra fascinating, and I don't want to just make this a gush fest about how much I love the character of Electra in Greek mythology, but I really like Euripides' interpretation of the myth. I only rated this 3 stars though because there really was something hollow to it. And I think in general, it's because I didn't see the play put on. It's because I sat there and just read it in an afternoon. And while there was a lot to enjoy about it, it's a very short play. And it's also, again, not one of his more well-known ones. So when I was looking up more information on this, wanting to see more discussion about it, I really didn't find very much. And so I have to wonder if maybe I'm correct and maybe I got mixed up. Maybe it's the Sophocles version of Electra that I really liked. And Rainey and I both said when we finished reading this that we wanted to kind of immediately read Sophocles' version. And that Rainey was surprised I found this, because every version she came across was the Sophocles version of Electra. So it was definitely an interesting reading experience, and it always makes me wonder and ponder when I reread something and I lower my rating. That's always my fear with rereading. And that's why I don't reread very often anymore, is I believe when I reread something that it's going to move down in my estimation, that it's going to fall in my rating scale a little bit. And this one did, but I think had I watched this, I would have enjoyed it a little bit more. And so I think I'm going to look up a performance of it. This translation is by James Morwood. I've never heard of him, which isn't saying much. I'm not really familiar with a lot of what's going on in classical translation right now, but I had some issues with the translation here. I often struggle with translations when they really update the language. And that's what happened here. I think in many ways it means that a translated classic is easier to read, especially if you're getting into classics. I think maybe picking up a translated classic would be the way to go, because typically translators will update the language a little bit for you. But in this case, I think some choices were made that I just didn't really agree with. And so that's also partially why I rated the play 3 stars. For the most part, this was a positive experience, but it has made me analyze my relationship with reading plays and whether or not that's something that I really enjoy doing. And so I don't really know now where I stand with plays that are currently on my TBR, if I even want to really just sit and read them, or if I want to try to find a performance of them. I know that's what most people enjoy doing and most people prefer that, but for years, I really preferred reading plays, again, because I think if I'm watching something, I don't catch all of the nuance. But that was my first read of Ancients-a-thon. As always, I am endlessly fascinated by different interpretations of myths. And so this one was a very interesting look at Electra that felt very traditional to me, but differed in a couple of different detailed ways, which I really enjoyed. And I think it was really helpful for me to have come off of reading Jennifer Saint's book on Electra before going into this, because it kind of refreshed my memory about certain details. And the play just kind of drops you into the middle, of course, as things go. It is an ancient Greek play. So I was glad that I had refamiliarized myself with the story before I got back into it. But I would love to know down below if this is one you have read, or if you prefer the Sophocles version. I just would love to talk about Electra down below. I love her. Do you also love complicated women in mythology, complicated women in stories? If so, tell me your favorite. Just in general, tell me your favorite lady in Greek mythology down below. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.